Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. Today, we're going to look at John Lennon through his journals once more. They give us a look into the personality of John Lennon, his private thoughts in the last years of his life. So let's continue. John Lennon and Yoko at the studio. A team was assembled in a few days' time for the album Double Fantasy, and Jack Douglas was asked to produce. He had produced for Aerosmith and Cheap Trick, and he had been an engineer for the Imagine album. He knew rock and roll, and he knew how to be sensitive to Yoko's avant-garde ways. The band was handpicked by Douglas. They were the best studio musicians: Hugh McCracken and Earl Slick on guitar, Tony Levin on bass, George Small on keyboards, Andy Newmark on drums, and Arthur Jenkins on percussion. They also got horn players and backup singers. They did rehearsals at the Dakota at first. The musicians were awestruck to be working with John. This made everybody nervous, even John. But Hugh McCracken, the guitarist, broke the ice by playing "I Want You." And then John laughed and said that was the first song he wrote about Yoko, and he said, "Most of my songs are about her, you know." Then the group moved to the Hit Factory on August the 8th. It was a recording studio in Midtown Manhattan. When John started going to the studio, he stopped writing in his journal on a daily basis. He just went to the studio to create Double Fantasy, starting over. And when that song was being worked on, the backup singer said, "We got ourselves a hit." Next, Yoko did "I'm Your Angel." She was nervous and her voice cracked, and she struggled to get through it. John and the musicians were urging her on, and she wasn't used to being encouraged. Before, she was laughed at by the engineers and producers. Yoko was so nervous she asked someone to bring her a vodka and a glass. John thought she was drinking water, and when he took a sip, he gasped. He asked, "Are you drinking, Mother?" And everyone laughed. Douglas had to spice together Yoko's song note by note from countless takes. Yoko was trying to be commercial, and her songs were a bit boring and didn't belong on the album. Douglas was willing to bring that up to her. He wanted to cut "Beautiful Boys." This song was Yoko's tribute to John and Sean. John didn't want the song to be cut. He asked the musicians to come up with something to make the song interesting, and they ended up doing a more provocative guitar work and improvised a classical-sounding melody. Douglas would guide Yoko through each song, and he would slap a beat on his thighs and on the floor. But somehow there was friction about the Lennons and Douglas over a contractual dispute, and it wasn't clear if Douglas was entitled to 3 or 5% of Double Fantasy royalties. Douglas was starting to show up late for sessions. John was mad, but he would leave Yoko to deal with him. The crew every day would go to the Hit Factory in the early evening. John was a tough boss and a perfectionist. He wanted the musicians to be totally concentrating. He didn't want them to smoke dope during the sessions, and when he was ready to play, he expected everyone to be ready too. And to keep their energy levels up, the musicians would eat candy bars and honey graham crackers, and they would play until midnight, then take a break for dinner. And they'd usually order something from Mr. Chow on A Street. And sometimes John and Yoko got into a corner of a room, quietly sitting arm in arm with each other. And sometimes a masseuse came to the studio to give the Lennons shiatsus. Sometimes a nanny would bring Sean to the studio in the early hours of the morning, and they would stay till dawn. And this was the first time Sean saw his mother and father work, and he would sit in John's lap on the control room and then fall asleep. So John's schedule, of course, was upside down. He was going to bed at 5 a.m., and when they were halfway through the sessions, he cut his hair in a conservative style, and he started to dress in a black suit, white shirt, and a black tie. John was worried the album was going to be mediocre, and as each day passed by, his fears grew, and he started to take out his feelings of being angry at Fred Seaman, his personal assistant. So when John was playing a song and it wasn't going well, he decided for some reason that the reason the song wasn't going well was because he wasn't wearing a hat. So he would make Fred go back to the apartment and get him a hat. Then he would get mad at Fred for not bringing the right hat back. And then also he felt like Fred took too long to get back to the studio, and he said, "Stupid effing fool, what do I pay you for? Can you do anything right? Haven't you got a brain in your effing head? Now bring me the right hat." It took 9 days to record 22 tracks, and 14 were used on the album, and John was amazed at how smoothly things had gone, and he thanked God. And Yoko was talking about touring and using Phil Spector to produce the next album, and John was afraid about his world changing and going upside down. Interviews. In the second week of September, John and Yoko granted interviews to Newsweek and Playboy, and they hadn't done interviews since 1975. They felt they were too open with the media, but they finally came up with the message. John was a house husband. He'd spent 5 years raising Sean and baking bread, while Yoko, whom he loved very much, ran the business. And that did it for the rest of the week. And they would work on mixing and remixing the LP, eat, and after dawn they would go to sleep. By the weekend they were totally exhausted, and the album was progressing well. The Lennons stayed in bed and canceled all interviews, and John had had enough for a while. October the 9th, it was John and Sean's birthdays. Last year, they didn't have any deadlines, only time. So John was turning 40, and he felt that everything was passing by in the blink of an eye, and it scared him. He was looking forward to 50, though. He recalled a quote by George Orwell, the author of 1984, saying, "At 50, everyone has the face they deserve." So that afternoon, John and Sean would have a birthday party at Tavern on the Green, an overpriced tourist restaurant in Central Park. John could see it from his bedroom window, and he was grateful to Yoko for arranging the party. Half the neighbors from the Dakota were invited. There were clowns, magicians, fire eaters that circulated throughout the crowd, and John was loving eating at the buffet table. There was a wide assortment of cakes and pies. It was a perfect afternoon. When they got home, John was feeling good. He had a telegram from George Martin and a letter from Aunt Mimi, and John was happy that George Martin had remembered his birthday. So the letter from Aunt Mimi ticked him off. It was a letter of criticism. So John wrote a reply, and he complained that Mimi never liked any of his friends. He told her he didn't lose his common sense, and that his songs weren't written for Victorians. He said he was glad that he didn't have to count on people like her to buy his music, because if he did, he'd be broke and probably still living with her in Liverpool. And he never did mail the letter. It sounds like at this time that John Lennon was having a midlife crisis. He was still hung up on time flying by, and it made him upset. He snorted heroin to kill the pain and prayed for God for the willpower not to do it again. On the day of his birthday, John woke up feeling pressure from the deadline of Double Fantasy. He listened to the birthday wishes on the radio, and he was surprised that he shared a birthday with John Entwistle from The Who and Jackson Browne. Then they all went to celebrate in the kitchen, the Lennons and the staff, and John put on a dunce-like birthday hat. It had 40 on it. He sat at the table with Sean, who was turning 5, and they cut the cake, blew out the candles, made wishes, and opened presents. John and Sean kissed Yoko, and Yoko was preoccupied on the phone the whole morning, monitoring the progress of Double Fantasy's editing and mixing. The fans were outside. Hearing about the upcoming album, the crowd was larger and louder than usual, and they chanted, "Happy birthday, John, happy birthday, Sean, and happy birthday, Yoko," even though it wasn't her birthday. So John sent them candy and balloons, and Sean and his nanny went to the roof to watch the crowd. The fans spotted him and said, "Where's John?" And Sean said he was sleeping and he can't come. So John watched from the bedroom window as skywriters wrote across his cloudless sky, "Happy birthday, John plus Sean, love Yoko." John didn't know the reason, but Yoko decided to move the Double Fantasy operation from the hit factory to the record plant. Now the Double Fantasy album gets completed. By October the 18th, Double Fantasy was completely remixed, and the only thing left was mastering it. So John had been too tired the last few days to go to the studio. He stayed in his room, thinking they would never finish the album without him. And once the album went on sale, the entire album was being played everywhere all the time, and it made John happy. But soon he started feeling despair. Compared to Bruce Springsteen and the Cars, his album didn't make it. It was mediocre. And John had been doing rock and roll for 25 years, and that was way too long. He didn't like the idea of recording and touring, and he felt that maybe he should drop out of sight and let Yoko take over, let the media focus on her and forget about him. He just wanted to be left alone. John's fear was unfounded because Double Fantasy was climbing up the charts. John was the only one feeling the album was mediocre. He felt it was nice to have a successful album, but something was missing. Maybe it was his mother. And when he was in his room and looking out the window to Central Park, he would think about life after death. He thought it would be blissful, but he didn't want to die. He had many good things going on, and he loved Sean and their relationship, and he would read to Sean at night, and reading to Sean made John happy. And Yoko at this time wasn't around very much. She was at the record plant to work on her single, Walking on Thin Ice, and she wanted it to get out by Christmas. And there was a video of the song, and John was needed for the lovemaking scene. John didn't really want to do the lovemaking scenes, but Yoko insisted, so he did it for her. Well, John kind of liked the solitude of Yoko not being around, but he did kind of miss her not being around at the same time. Before Thanksgiving, John and Yoko met with Ringo and his fiancée Barbara Bach in their suite at the Plaza Hotel. Barbara had new photos of her in the same issue of Playboy magazine as John and Yoko in their interview. So John studied the photos, and seeing her in person, he felt she was a beauty. John, Yoko, and Ringo were talking business. Barbara was tending to her kids, and Ringo mentioned he was working on the album Stop and Smell the Roses. He needed material as soon as possible, and John said he would write a few songs for him, and Ringo was happy. So once more, I'll stop the video here, and we have more information to discover about John, and I'll continue that on the next video. So I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. And thank you for all who watched the videos that I've done. I really appreciate it. I hope everybody's been having a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you.